Joining me this week for the interview is Zaretta Hammond. Zaretta is a national consultant and the author of 2015's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, Promoting Authentic Engagement and Rigor for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students. She is a former high school and community college expository writing instructor. And for the past 20 years, she has supported schools and other institutions in deepening their understanding and application of culturally responsive practices, which is exactly why I've invited Zaretta to be here today. She currently runs the Culturally Responsive Education by Design online PLC, which is a 6-month intensive inquiry-based professional learning experience designed to build instructional capacity to use culturally responsive tools and practices effectively. Zaretta is a strong literacy advocate who also sits on the board of trustees for the Center of the Collaborative Classroom. She's also a member of the advisory board for the Consortium for Reading Education. So now, listeners, you know exactly why I've been relentlessly messaging Zaretta to have her on the podcast. So Zaretta, I am thrilled to have you here today.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm glad we can make it happen.
We finally were able to make it happen. Listeners, I'm only half kidding about relentlessly pursuing this interview. I've been very inspired by Zaretta's work. The book we're going to talk about today is fantastic. And certainly, I think Zaretta probably realized the only way to stop me from messaging her is to finally agree to be on the podcast. So I'm really thankful that you have agreed. So, okay, so let's jump in. Before we get into the topic of culturally responsive teaching, let's start with your background, Zaretta. I highlighted the resume for listeners, but if you could just fill in the resume, the highlights of your career, what has led you to this point so far professionally?
And it's really interesting. I consider myself a boots on the ground kind of teacher, right? I've never left that persona and that kind of image and identity for myself. But my resume started with, uh, you know, getting into teaching quite by happenstance. I started as a writing tutor at the University of um, California, Berkeley. And from there, really started to see that I was very passionate about education. From there, though, rather than go right into the classroom, where you would think that would be the natural next step, I went into policy. So I spent a number of years in education policy, working for organizations like the Education Commission of the States, looking at new policies around Goals 2000 back in the day.
Yeah.
The standards movement, redesigning, restructuring education. There was actually a initiative called Restructuring, where schools were looking at how do we do something different. So I did that for almost 5, 6 years. Then I went into program evaluation, looking inside programs that had been funded by the likes of the Hewlett Foundation and the Kellogg Foundation. And these were mostly education programs. And a lot of them had a focus on multicultural education. So I was an education program evaluation specialist. I did that for probably 7 years. All the while, I was looking for ways in which to improve education. Finally, I got so fed up with policy, I said, I got to get closer. And that meant going into a teacher education program. I did my master's as well as my teaching certificate at the same time. And I had my son. I don't recommend all of that at once. But that's where I stepped into the classroom formally. And secondary English education was my jam, in particular, teaching composition. My job wasn't to teach English, short stories, all the things that I actually love, but it was to make sure that the students coming to me who were not yet well-developed expository writers, essay writers, argumentative writers, left me more competent in those areas. And I got to see the difference between those students that had an opportunity for a high quality instruction and those that had not. And so again, continued to radicalize me. And from there, I came out after my time in the classroom, probably a total of 5, 6 years of classroom teaching where I had my own classroom. I came out and started to do curriculum development in my English department. From there, I left and started to do work with intermediary organizations at the start of the education reform movement. And that continued. I was at the National Equity Project for 8 years. I did that work with the Bay Area School Reform Collaborative when the Annenberg grants, large, multi-million dollar grants were being given to see if we can do reform. Small schools movement, I was involved in some of that as well. So my journey has been in pretty much every facet of the work, but I've stayed close to the classroom. I always make sure I'm working with teachers, teacher leaders, being in their classrooms, because that instructional core is really where change is going to happen. It's not the standards movement, it's not the policies. All of those are important, but they are not the thing that actually builds student capacity. So
Mhm.
that is kind of my trajectory. And then I left National Equity Project because, they're a leadership organization doing really great work. And I am passionate about instructional equity. I left and I wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching the Brain, not because I wanted to write this book. Writing a book is hard work, and sometimes it's like I'd rather give a kidney. Just take that. But the reality is, I had a number of teachers roll up on me how I had been coaching. They're like, "You need to write this down." And
Mhm.
finally, after about the fourth or fifth group kind of just like started to get kind of loud about it, I just said, "Okay, I'm going to write it down, and I'm going to go back to what I'm doing." So
Mhm.
that was 7, almost 8 years ago, and this little book has had a life of its own. But those were the ways that I had been training teachers, because I consider myself now a teacher educator. And I'm
Mhm.
really passionate about making sure teachers that are coming through alternative pathways like teacher residency programs, alternative certification paths, really get the same type of um, deep understanding about the science of learning, culturally responsive practice, that is going to make a difference for their students, right? Putting students at the center, not just some superficial shenanigans that a lot of people are peddling out there.
Right, for sure. You are so right about writing a book. As someone who's authored and co-authored several books, having the book in your hands is a phenomenal feeling. There's no feeling like it. But my word, that it is work. And you're right about, sometimes you think I would rather donate a kidney than write another sentence or try to deal
Absolutely.
with the challenges of writing. Okay, so let's jump into this. And I absolutely love the connection, because between the culturally responsive teaching and the brain, and I think the neuroscience is a fascinating part of this. One of the biggest ideas I took from the book is that culturally responsive teaching is not just this checklist. It's not just a bag of tricks, as you say, that it is a serious and powerful tool for accelerating student learning. And you make the connection between neuroscience or brain based teaching and learning and rigorous culturally responsive teaching. So, what exactly, for our listening audience, what exactly is that connection?
Well, the idea with culturally responsive teaching is that you are doing a couple of things. And the first thing I want to, say is th- there is a way in which some people come into culturally responsive teaching with a deficit orientation, meaning the reason we do this is because those kids, right? Those whoever those kids
Right.
are broken, or they are not motivated. And therefore, we're going to use this. This is some gimmick to get them in, but we're really not going to change up a lot. We're going to diversify our library, classroom libraries, or we're going to put social justice themes into the curriculum. What I wanted to help people understand is culturally responsive teaching is a way to help students really regain academic prowess. Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings, when she coined this phrase, she talked about the kind of the pillars of it. And one of those pillars was academic prowess. And this is so connected to the science of learning, right? Because only the learner learns. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of things that we're doing in education. The teacher is busy, but if it doesn't translate to getting the student to do a new thing or having new insights or stretching their background knowledge, it's not going to happen. So the way I talk about it is, on one side, you have high trust and a low stress environment, meaning that teacher knows how to create an environment in which a community of learners can come in. Their learner identity is not in conflict with their racial identity. And the only reason it would be in conflict is because some of the social narratives about students who speak a different first language, students who come from low income communities, students who may be Black or dark skinned, because we have narratives around dark skinned people or anti Black narratives. And that's important. And it's important not as the end point, but it's important because part of what we really have to be able to do is to improve students' information processing skills. And that's very different from, doing critical thinking, a lot of people hear, or executive function. Information processing is the ability to take inert information, random facts and figures, mix it together with what we already know on our working memory, and turn it into usable knowledge. So this is already in what we know about the intersection of cognitive and social neuroscience, right? That cognition has social aspects to it, has emotional aspects. So social emotional SEL work is connected to cognition, not siloed. So culturally responsive teaching is bringing these two together in a way where it's mindful and responsive to who the student is in front of you, so that you're able to help that student get their brain calm and ready, and then move into productive struggle without it, raising or triggering some emotional meltdown, because you don't see yourself as being able to do that. And this is more than just growth mindset. That's where I hear, like, a lot of people like, oh, it's grit, or that's growth mindset. No, it actually is not just that. It is really being able to kind of create the conditions in the instructional core. So I connect three elements of the science of learning to that. I did that cognition, social and emotional pieces are all integrated. We know this from the science of learning. And that the brain wants to make meaning. So when we start to give students the opportunity for productive struggle, meaning they're complex ideas to pull apart and put together versus kind of the rote learning, because we know rote learning does not grow dendrites or gray matter. And that's what the malleability, that neuroplasticity of information processing does. The more we do this kind of chewing on the content, mixing it with the content that we already know, the funds of knowledge we're bringing from home, then that is how the brain gets smarter. But too often, when we're looking at the students that are furthest behind, or when we're looking at who's achieving in a school district and who's not achieving, chronically, we have poor students at the bottom, Black and brown students and Indigenous students, Pacific Islander students at the bottom. And if we keep giving them this kind of pedagogy of compliance, it won't grow brain power. So the culturally responsive teaching stands in contrast to a pedagogy of compliance. If I just do this and tell the student to do it, that's going to grow their brain power. We need something that's a little more interactive, a little more maker-centered, because this aligns with collectivist cultural practices.
Do you think that as I listen to you talk about how some take a gimmick approach, a strategy approach, a deficit approach, does that emerge because of how we start with our definition of what success in school is? I mean, let's call it what it is. Success in school has often been defined through a white Eurocentric kind of lens, and is that part of the reason why educators, either individually or as a collective in a school or a school district, see students who are culturally diverse as starting from a deficit?
I don't think so. And I think
Okay.
that's what we usually want to go, like, oh, it's racism. I would say that there is the history of what we've done, how we've structured public education. And the reason I say that we have to look at the structures, it's too easy. And we see often this happening, that it's just people behaving badly.
Hmm.
And if we all just had implicit bias training, we'd behave better and then it would be different. Well, it won't, because the mechanisms that churn out and sort students and create what I call a cognitive red line are embedded in our system.
Mhm.
We in America, we some to some degree in Canada, we can see that with boarding schools and what that
Right.
curriculum was for Indigenous students and children. It is predicated on kind of giving you the lowest level of curriculum so that you can be compliant, not so that you can grow brain power. So when we think about what success is in, US schools, for example, it's really not serving even white students. It's
Mhm.
speed, right? If you could do math fast,
Right.
right? It doesn't mean that you understand mathematical thinking, but you just have to be fast. And so again, there are behaviors, do you connect it to Eurocentric culture? You probably could do that, but we
Mhm.
still have to look at what are those things we need to change, right? What is that pedagogy of compliance
Right.
for particular children? And what are the markers of what is a successful student doing? And a lot of those students have a fixed mindset, even if they are white and middle class and look like
Right.
on the
Right.
surface, they're not being successful.
Mhm.
So I think we have to go deeper and a little beyond the kind of trope of, oh, it's just racism and therefore
Yeah.
we just put a social justice lens on it. That ain't helping nobody. And it really
No.
is not going to help us grow the brain power of children by saying, oh, somehow they need to do something different, because that's its own type of deficit
Mhm.
orientation.
Yeah, I appreciate the clarification there. What I was thinking more was not along the lines of that schools themselves or individuals are racist, but that the tradition of school, as it was born out of medieval churches and Renaissance, sort of the church and how it emerged in North America, sort of set a tone for what quote unquote success looks like in a school. What does it mean to be a successful student? But I think you hit the nail on the head when you talk about compliance. I think we have for too long honored and almost supported and encouraged this compliance, which really doesn't challenge the brain, doesn't challenge thinking, doesn't help the students grow in that matter. I love your assertion that culture is the way that every brain makes sense of the world, and that you highlight three levels of culture in the book. You talk about surface culture, shallow culture, and deep culture. So first, if you would, could you walk us through each of those three levels and then tie them back to culturally responsive teaching? Like, why is building our awareness of those three levels so important for us as teachers as we try to continue to be more culturally responsive to our students?
So first, I just want to talk about the different types of culture, because I do feel like this is a place where a lot of people get really off track. So before we talk about the three levels of culture, I just want to talk about three different types of culture, right?
Sure.
And one is transitory culture. This is the culture of your age group, young adult culture. I have young adult children, and
Mhm.
their culture is like, not, empty nester culture, right? These are transitory in the sense that we move in and out of them, and how we decide to group ourselves comes with a set of norms and beliefs and behaviors. That's all culture is, right? Then there's organizational culture, right? That's the
Mhm.
kind of culture that if you go into a corporation or a school district, these are the behaviors. This is how we do. These are the norms, right? Then the culture that I'm talking about when I dig into these three layers is our nurture culture. That's what I label it, but it really is our socialization from 0 to 7. These are the
Mhm.
ways in which you learn how close you stand to people, how far you stand to people, what is looking in the eye look like, and all of those things that are a lot of unspoken things that you learn. Like, you're not born and someone hands you a handbook that says, here is how you're going to move through this culture that you are born into. So that's the one piece. Now, the reality is, this information is really helpful because when we start to think about these three types of cultures, though, the more we understand their overlay, the more we can use culture as an affective lens. How do we create an environment in the classroom where brains feel calm and ready because there's a sense of belonging, right? It is
Mhm.
me and what I experience at home or in my wider community outside of school, and the organization that in some ways is being able to be complementary or congruent with that. Then you have culture as a cognitive scaffold. So this is where I use the schema that you might bring as a young adult to help you move through some content if you were, say, at college, or the metaphors I use for young children because it's something that is in their lived experience, right?
Mhm.
So those are the types of culture. But let's talk for a minute about this idea of culture and the culture tree. So in culturally responsive teaching the brain, I talk about it as a tree. A lot of people talk about culture as an iceberg, like there's some
Mhm.
stuff below the surface we don't see. The reason I use a tree, not an iceberg, is an iceberg is a dead thing and it doesn't grow, it doesn't change. It's just a hunk of ice not connected to anything.
Right.
Whereas culture is really about people being connected. Think Avatar, right?
Yeah.
When they put that little braid into the thing is one of my favorite movies, or the people would
Yeah.
all link up, and then the mother tree there, right? So I
Mhm.
envision culture as a tree, and there are three layers of that tree. A lot of times people start at the top and move down. I think people should start where most trees start, at the root. So the first level is actually deep culture. This is again nurture culture, the
Yeah.
socialization from 0 to 7, your notions of the cosmology, how the world works, your sense of kinship. What does that mean?
Mhm.
Communication patterns. Then we move up to the middle, which is the trunk. And that's kind of like the base of a tree, right? So
Mhm.
this is where we have shallow culture. And it's not shallow because it's less than, it's shallow because it's right under the surface.
Mm.
Meaning I travel a lot. And when I travel through New York or when I'm coming through Canada, if I'm just there for a day or two, someone's going through Paris and you're not really interacting, they look the same, right? I
Right.
I really don't know until I've stayed there a few days or maybe a week, and the longer I stay, the first month, I would say, "Oh, wow, this is radically different."
Mhm.
And it's those cultural patterns. Are we standing online or in line? Do we go to the grocery store and get our food? And this is how we do when we go to the bakery. This is what courtesy looks like or doesn't look like. Those are all the unspoken rules that you have to learn when you are moving through a culture. That's shallow culture. Then
Okay.
you have surface culture. This is unfortunately where a lot of people think culturally responsive teaching lives. What it actually lives in shallow culture. But surface culture is what you see: music, art, foods, those are the dance, that's multicultural education.
Mhm.
And what's important to understand is in that band of shallow culture and deep culture is where we get to use culture as a cognitive scaffold, right? And
Mhm.
that's going to be the most important. Surface culture becomes important because I can use it as that affective gateway. But once I
Okay.
come in, if you're acting and behaving in ways that I interpret as disrespectful, I'm not going to feel like I belong. So that you have to know and start to learn. That's why I talk about this idea of cultural archetypes. I can't know 100 different cultures, but there are
Right.
a few things you can start to learn that are
Yeah.
going to be patterned across different groups based on where they are on that continuum between individualistic culture and collectivist culture. Here's the
Right.
other thing I'll say quickly, Tom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Neither one is bad. I see a lot of people demonizing, well, individualistic culture is white and it's bad and it's oppression. No, they're neutral. It's just culture.
Mhm.
And everybody has some mix of them. Nobody's pure one thing. And there are white cultural groups, white groups who are very collectivist. You've
Right.
seen some Irish people lately.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true.
Okay?
Yeah.
Certain Italian groups and
Yeah.
ethnic groups
Mhm.
within that, right? Slavic, all of those folks, Greek, can be very collectivist. So
Mm.
it's
Right.
not a black and white sort of thing, right?
No,
Which is
fair.
the
Yeah.
fun. I'll pause
Yeah.
there.
No, I think that's fair. I'm interested because I think a lot of people may have. My brain was gravitating toward culturally responsive teaching lives in deep culture, not shallow culture. So I'm interested to pick up on that.
Well,
Uh, so
yeah,
go
what
ahead
I
and
what I
to
say
go
is
a
it
little bit
lives
more than
in
that.
It lives in deep and shallow.
Oh, okay. So I misunderstood that. Yeah.
Yes. So
Okay.
the idea is that if I don't understand the schema around the deep culture, then I can't act it. Think of deep culture as understanding conceptually, and
Right.
shallow culture is enacting it.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. I wanted to pick up on that because I must have misunderstood you when you said that. The other piece that you brought up, which I want to transition to, which I found very uh, engaging in the book, was this talk about cultural archetypes. The you know the For me it resonated because I think a lot of teachers look at situations, and especially I work with overseas schools, and in those situations there are some schools where there are 60 or 70 different countries and or cultures represented in this incredibly diverse environment.
That's right.
So you bring up this idea, like, how do I be culturally responsive to the 19 cultures in my classroom? So but your point is that you want to emphasize this idea that students are at the center, not strategies. It's the students who sit at the center. So how do those archetypes help teachers be more responsive to their students in their classrooms? How
Yeah.
does that help us with managing a situation where we're trying to figure out how to be responsive to 19 or 25 different cultures in our classroom?
Yeah, and I do some work with international schools as well,
Mhm.
and part of what I try to help, whether you're in the U.S. and you're in Canada or other spaces, and this is always happening because you do have the United Nations in there,
Yeah,
and a lot of
literally.
people will then kind of default to what I call the Kumbaya Effect. If
Mm.
we just mention everybody's culture, then you're going to feel welcomed because we've mentioned your culture. Kind of, it's a small world approach. But for a lot of students, when you understand kind of particularly historically marginalized folks, that's not getting rid of some of the bias toward individualistic cultural orientations and ways of being, right? So the idea of responding is not I'm responding to individual students, is those archetypes, again, back on the continuum of collectivism and individualism, you start to see, oh, I probably have 6 groups that fall, you know, a group that's probably closer to the end of individualism, another group that might be closer to the end of collectivism, 2 that might be plotting somewhere in the middle. So now the practices of when we come into the classroom are some mix so students can find an access point. So you're bringing them into the sphere of the classroom, the community. It's not that I've got to do this for this one and do this for that one. And then the teacher feels overwhelmed. Oh, I got to remember, your special handshake and your special thing. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about when you come into the classroom, there are various things that allow you to not only find an access point because it's congruent, but also to learn new things because here's another way of being. And here's what I
Mhm.
will say: historically marginalized students already know an individualistic way.
Mhm.
They are just not seeing anything that is congruent with their sense of belonging and how belonging looks for them. Let's take talking as one example. In collectivist cultures, regardless of the expression of collectivism, we're not even go into that rabbit hole right now, but just know that collectivism is expressed differently, right? Within different cultural and racial groups. Uh, but there are still some red threads, and this is the way I talk about it. Those archetypes are the red thread. There are commonalities. One commonality across collectivist cultures is talking, that the social lubrication before you get into any technical thing is to actually sync up and co-regulate, and using the terminology of trauma informed and trauma sensitive practice, we co-regulate our nervous systems together. Part of
Mhm.
that is by the social lubrication. We get oxytocin really high because we may actually have to do hard work together, or we may have to have a hard conversation or do some hard thinking. And what we know is oxytocin is one of the things that lowers the cortisol. This is what's so interesting between things that people have done for eons, right?
Mhm.
Centuries. that when you put the lens of science on it, you start to see, oh, wow, that's what we currently call trauma informed practices or co regulation, or right. And the idea is that not that those groups have had trauma, it's just that's how collectivist people keep themselves actually well.
Mhm.
They don't, before any trauma comes, this is why that resilience is there. So, talking is one example. Most collectivist cultures, before there's anything to any work started, there is a small social small talk, right? In
Mhm.
Hawaiian culture, they call it talk story. Other cultures, it's like we're going to chat. We're going to just like check in with each other, shoot the breeze.
Mhm.
But if you look at the way most classrooms are designed, let's come in. I'm gonna put the do now on the board. We're gonna take attendance. So we go right to the individualistic technical.
Mhm.
So if we're balancing cultural ways of being, then there should be a way for those students who are regulating through getting in sync with others that we can actually do that. I teach folks how to use dyads, right? An
Mhm.
interactive way to do that. How do we use protocols for social? Doesn't have to take up a lot of instructional minutes. But when it's structured as a routine, kids come in and know I'm going to have this opportunity. And the teacher, when they're being responsive, they know they can tie it to the upcoming lesson. Have a social game that the kids do together. And
Mhm.
that's the game playing is another way we co-regulate and we sync up and we release oxytocin. We get in sync with one another. These would be all in line with what collectivist practices without me having to say, we're going to do a collective practice now. I am being culturally responsive. If you say that, you are not being culturally responsive.
Exactly.
If you're professing your
Yeah.
responsiveness, you
Yeah.
ain't being responsive because it
Yeah.
is hidden to the brain. I call it
Mhm.
hide the vegetables. The brain doesn't know why it's feeling so at home. I'm feeling
Mhm.
calm. I'm ready to do this work. It is saying these things without being able to put its finger on why am I feeling a sense of belonging. But what
Mhm.
I see a lot of teachers do, particularly white teachers, is they make it technical.
Right.
We're going to do these handshakes. Well, what about the kids who are ready to get to work? And the
Right.
handshakes aren't talking. That's you and the kid. That's not them as a community. So there are all these gimmicks that I see that people point to, like, oh, we're doing that, but you really aren't.
Yeah.
You aren't
Yeah.
giving the student a chance to actually talk in the way that they would do it at home, or even when the volume goes up, right? Or they're overlapping. We're not turn taking and talking. We're talking over each other, just like we do when we go out to, Applebee's and we're just in a big group, right? You're
Yeah.
talking to this
Right.
one, you turn and talk to that one. Nobody
Yeah.
complains about that, but we over control in classrooms around these
Right.
kind of technical ways. So that's just one example
Mhm.
of using collectivist practice, which is, talk, to get social, to get centered, to get ready for cognitive work.
Mhm. I love that. Anytime you make a, I love that anytime you make that proclamation that you're doing something, you're probably not doing something. The something that you're proclaiming, right? That's probably a good rule to follow in teaching in probably all walks of life for sure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Let's finish up now. I want to ask you to highlight for us the Ready for Rigor framework, which you say helps teachers, of course, understand the basics of culturally responsive pedagogy and deepens the connection through neuroscience. Those four aspects are awareness, learning partnerships, information processing, and community of learners and learning environment. And we've talked a little bit about awareness through the discussion of the three layers of culture and the cultural archetypes, but maybe walk us through the other three and then maybe draw that their interconnectedness, and they're not, even though we talk about them as four separate aspects, they really aren't four separate aspects or four separate silos. There's a real interconnectedness between them. So walk
Right.
us through that framework.
Yeah. If you see the framework, right,
Yeah.
visually, for those of you that get the book, you can turn to the, very beginning.
Yeah.
It has the framework. At the
Hmm.
center is so important because at the center is the student is a cognitively independent learner. That we're doing culturally responsive practices so that we can coach the student to higher levels of cognition, not because he's broken, but because historically schools have redlined cognition and cognitive development. And we're trying
Hmm.
to reverse that in terms of creating a different kind of instructional equity experience. But we're also doing that by helping the student strengthen their learning muscles, right? So,
Hmm.
this ability to take information that's inert and turn it into usable knowledge, leveraging their funds of knowledge, the background knowledge that they learn in school. So that's what culturally responsive teaching is about.
Hmm.
And these elements, right, these dimensions are important in terms of capacity that teachers need to have. So, one is learning partnerships, and it's really important. There are three parts to the learning partnership: building rapport, that's building a sense of friendliness and trust between the student and your group of students, and helping them do that between themselves. But this is really your learning partnership. You leverage that rapport so that you can build what I call that alliance, meaning the student is two grade levels behind in reading. Listen, in 6 weeks, we can get you to know how all the long vowels work. We look at each other and we talk explicitly about, hey, let's get up to that. This is not a contract. I'm not giving a prescription. I'm inviting the student to partner with me. I'm going to
Hmm.
do this. This is what you're going to do. And now we're up to it in terms of me changing my coaching moves to coach the student actually looking at and paying attention to their learning moves. So there's a lot more in that alliance piece. And when you do that, the teacher has cognitive insight. The student will reveal themselves because that teacher's ability to build that trust and to use that trust and rapport as fuel to push the student with care. So students need care and push. The alliance is where the teacher's coaching the student. And we talk about this as the warm demander, but a lot of ways in which that term has been kind of bastardized, warm, strict,
Hmm.
I'm just kind of holding high expectations. Well, you need to do a little more than hold high expectations because that's about you. You tell the student, well, I hold high expectations. I believe you can. You don't put someone in the deep end of the ocean, of a pool, and say, I have high expectations. You can swim. You got to actually teach them how to swim. So a
Right.
warm demander actually has this thing called active demandingness, meaning in that alliance, I'm coaching you. I'm not doing it for you. Right now, I see a lot of over scaffolding. Teachers over scaffold, they spoon feed because the student's not able to take on grade level material on their own,
Hmm.
instead of teaching the student how to build the capacities to do that, right? So
Yeah.
that's the learning partnership. So important because it's not something that you'd like, oh, I'm doing a learning partnership. Well, not if the student's doing the same old thing and you're still
Hmm.
over scaffolding, right? The goal of
Yeah.
that is both of you can take on new roles. And what are we doing that for? We're doing that for the purpose of improving information processing. That's what the teacher is actually coaching the student. How do I actually do better chewing? And chewing in the information processing cycle is elaboration, right? It's taking new content has to be coupled with old or existing content or background knowledge. That's what cognitive neuroscience says. If you
Hmm.
just repeat something, but you've not done anything with it, we have to manipulate it. We have to pull it apart. We have to look at it. We have to have at least two complexities in there. And when we do that, we call that productive struggle. So information
Hmm.
processing is actually taking students so that they learn these cognitive routines in their own head,
Hmm.
not as a strategy you give them, but it's internalized that when I look at a task, I know how to start processing
Right.
to get to understanding. I pay attention to when I'm confused, and that confusion is information to me about where I may have made an error, right? So there's all this
Hmm.
kind of processing that happens, and it's very different from saying, oh, we're going to have kids do critical thinking. Critical thinking rests on information processing.
Hmm.
Think of information processing as the base. What I see a lot of people talking about when they talk about culturally responsive teaching is the relational piece. And they
Right.
never get to the instructional piece to improve information processing. The
Hmm.
last piece I'll talk about is that community of learners. And this is what we know that kind of growth in your cognition, ability to grow your learning muscles, learn new stuff, that kind of increase in taking on more rigor or cognitive load happens because we have a community of learners, not just a
Mhm.
classroom of compliant students. Meaning, kids have structures, they get to talk to each other, they're up to inquiry together, they're experimenting. And so it's in this milieu that those students are actually getting smarter,
Mhm.
right? But what we have currently is turn and talk, which is weak. Then, oh, we're doing a group project. So the kids that can are usually carrying the group project,
Mhm.
right? There are no opportunities
Yeah.
for students to do real kind of cognitive work on their own. It's not maker centered. So that's really what the framework is trying to get us to do. We need relationships so that we can initiate student into improving information processing. But a lot of people just kind of stop at relationships as evidence of being culturally responsive. And
Mhm.
that's not true. There's no academic prowess in that.
Right, right, and that is the key is creating that increased cognitive load and making sure that we're focused on those creating that community of learners, so that we put
But
students and their learning at the center.
yes, but here's what I would say, Tom, just a little tweak to that. We
Sure.
are teaching the student to process information. We're
Yeah.
not giving them process information. We're setting up conditions
For
for them to engage in productive struggle. That's what we're doing. But
sure.
they are actually learning how to process information better with our coaching.
Yeah.
Right now, that's not what US schools do.
No, and that's
We
fair. And
ca
I think I see a lot of parallels in the work in the circle that I run in terms of assessment. We often talk to teachers about the fact that developing your expertise in assessment is not the end game. The end game is you developing an expertise so that you can then transfer that to students and give them the opportunity to be able to examine themselves, to self-regulate their learning, to push
That's right.
themselves to
So,
cognitive rigor. So there's a lot of overlap there for sure.
well, not only is there overlap, it's not those are 2 sides of the same coin, because
Yeah,
this is
exactly.
what a community of learner does. So one of the things
Yeah.
that I in the our online PLC, culturally responsive education by design, online PLC, what we do is we talk about how do you create a culture of error. So when we look at
Mhm.
what is a community of learners doing? Well, they exist in a culture of errors. Joe Feldman, I don't know if you know Joe, but
Yep.
Joe and I told him he needed to write that book. Before even he wrote that book, this is what
Mhm.
he and I would get in the coffee shops and
Mhm.
talk about. I know him through his wife. And I
Yeah.
finally, we would have these deep conversations like, Joe, you need to write that down.
Mhm.
I introduced him to my editor and say, Dan,
Yeah.
you need to
Yeah.
get that book out of Joe because
Yeah.
these are two sides of the same coin. It's not an
Right.
overlap at all. And the way that we keep talking about it silos that. So what
Right.
is a community of learners are doing? They're actually learning from their mistakes. That's what productive struggle is. Like, oh
Mhm.
wow, I was confused there, but look, this is how I got myself unstuck. Now I'm getting together. So I talk about this success protocol. And it's probably
Mhm.
misnamed because it really is about how did I move from not knowing and can't do to this is how I did it. So I'm not just
Right.
talking about my success, but I'm talking about my learning progression,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
again, I think it is formative assessment is a critical part of what exists within that community of learner quadrant.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Assessment for me is what drives learning and the ability to recognize where you are in your process, what you need, what is next for you as a learner. How do you drive that learning
That's
forward?
right.
What questions do you have? All of that is so critical.
But that's
Uh,
not what we get with the pedagogy of compliance. You look in
you.
large classes of low income kids, black and brown kids,
Mhm.
kids who are considered, behind grade level.
Mhm.
That's not what they're getting.
No, absolutely. 40 minutes in, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface on all of this topics. And listeners, if you're like me, you're probably going to listen to this interview 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Bring your notepads. This has been a fascinating conversation, Zaretta. Two questions left as we
Yeah.
finish up today. These are questions I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. The first one, you can take this in any direction you want to, but it's quite simply this: educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
Uh, whew, 2 things. One is the fact that we have um, been derelict in our responsibility to ensure that every child is a powerful reader as they enter late elementary. Um,
Mhm.
our hair should be on fire with the number of students who are reading a 1 to 2 grade levels behind. And on average, Black and Brown children get to high school and they're reading 3 to 4 grade levels behind. And this
Mhm.
is consistent for decades, and no one's addressing it. So that keeps me up at night in terms of how do we turn that statistic on its head, and how do we make sure every teacher sees him or herself as a reading teacher in a way that I don't need a degree in that. There's some really simple things we should be doing. The other thing is this cognitive redlining, that
Yeah.
the idea that we are not helping students build their learning muscles, the ability to leverage neuroplasticity, that malleability by
Mhm.
productive struggle. A lot of teachers, and the reason it keeps me up at night is it's not just that we're not doing it for the children, it's a lot of teachers don't get the kind of training in the sciences of learning, cognitive neuroscience, the intersection of social neuroscience, and they're getting these brain bits. You know, the
Mhm.
idea of brain-based learning, as opposed to what, the kidney-based learning? What the hell is that? We even say it all the time, the brain-based learning. Well,
Yeah.
that's what the brain does. And
Right.
teachers do not get, they have learned to cover their content, but not how to help students actually learn that content more effectively, AKA information processing. These
Right.
are not new things that I made up. This is what I do when I write, is all this good research is out there. I
Mhm.
try to bring it together and braid it together so that it's not only understandable, but actually is practical. This is what Freire talks about when he talks about liberatory education. It has to have conceptual understanding that leads to informed action, and that is uh, buttressed by critical analysis and self-reflection. So
Mhm.
we need to get beyond just covering our content and really thinking about instructional equity. So that's a thing that keeps me in my writing chair.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are two big ones for sure. Last question is about success, personal success, professional success. Again, take this in any direction you wish. But the question is simply: if a random person stopped you on the street and said, "What is your definition of success?" How would you answer them?
Oh, wow. I think my definition of success is that every person learns about themselves as a learner and is able to actualize it, can find their zone of excellence and
Mhm.
zone of genius and figure out how to build their life around the thing that they are gifted to do and feel driven as part of their mission in life to do.
Mhm.
And that we
Mhm.
should be able to sustain ourselves, do good in the world, and not feel the tensions of capitalism or I got to get this job to be successful. But to success is being able to have impact, to give back to the world, to do good, and to actually have a life that for yourself feels abundant and flourishes.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Find your zone of excellence and pursue that. And finding that would be definitely bring success to anyone's life without question. Listeners, you can and should follow Zaretta on a number of different platforms. You can find Zaretta on Twitter. The handle is at Ready for Rigor. The number 4 is in the middle, so it's Ready for Rigor. On Instagram, the handle is at CRT and the Brain, so culturally responsive teaching and the Brain. That's on Instagram. Zaretta's on Facebook and LinkedIn as well. I'll have links in the show notes for all of those social media links, as well as the website, www.crtandthebrain.com. And that's the website as well that you can find out more
Yeah.
about
And
Zaretta's work.
And I've got my old blog there. I'm not blogging anymore, but
No,
there's like 5 years of blog posts there, so it's
perfect.
good info.
Absolutely. I'm sure there's more great information for listeners. Zaretta, this will be the understatement of the year. This was a fantastic conversation. Your expertise and insight is amazing, and certainly I've learned a tremendous amount during this interview, and would look forward to any opportunities going forward to speak with you again. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, and I look forward to, maybe getting together and talking about formative assessment, one of the
Love
things
that.
I actually like to talk about as well.
Well, I might take you up on that because trying to bring together, culturally responsive assessment practices is something that has definitely been on my mind. So don't be surprised if you get an email from me going
All
forward.
right.
Soretta, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.